August 2nd, 1914. A broiling hot August afternoon. The streets of the village all but deserted. Suddenly, a drum roll. Probably a travelling merchant setting up shop on the main square, or maybe some acrobats announcing their evening performance. But no, it's not that. Unthinking people seemed proud to live in a time when something so magnificent was about to happen. Even the most indifferent didn't doubt for an instant that victory would be prompt and decisive. Wouldn't Austria shatter into pieces at the first shock of a Russian attack? And wouldn't Germany be ground to bits between France and Russia, like a nut in a gigantic vice? Everyone got ready, at a fever pitch, as if they really feared not getting there in time before the victory was complete. A few headed off even before their appointed departure dates. We saw extraordinary things. Irreconcilable brothers suddenly reconciled, mothers-in-law and their sons-in-law, who the day before would have been smacking each other and pulling each other's hair out, now exchanging kisses, neighbours who weren't speaking, now engaging in the friendliest of dialogues. There were no more political adversaries, insults, injuries, hatreds. All was forgotten. The first effect of the war was the accomplishment of a miracle. Peace, concord, reconciliation among people who hated each other. Would this fraternal spirit last? The future will tell. On August 4th, the third day of mobilization, about half the mobilized men of the village embarked at the train station, accompanied by almost the whole population. Everyone showed courage, whether true or false. There were only 2 women whose nerves were so sensitive that they fainted away at the sight of their sons or husbands leaving. At this time I was only just recovering from a serious illness, an erysipelas of the face which had sapped all my strength. On August 4th, the date set for my departure, it was all I could do to walk around my bedroom. I wasn't in any condition to march on Berlin. The gendarmes, alerted to the impossibility of my departure, would hear nothing of it. I had to leave, just like everyone else. I no longer belonged to myself. I belonged to the fatherland, like a soul condemned to Satan's power. My family went crazy. In this situation, my political opponents, who held the reins of municipal power, forgetting that I had done everything I could to oust them, went out of their way to pull me out of this mess. One of them took my father in his automobile and went to find the prefect of the Oder Departement, who, hesitating, handed me over to the mercy of my recruitment commander, who responded that I had to join up as soon as I could. A few days later, feeling strong enough to make the journey, I left for Narbonne to join the depot of the 125th Territorial Regiment, installed in a former Capuchin monastery, whose monks had been asked a few years earlier to go chant their daily offices in Spain. A mob of soldiers filled Narbonne, dressed half in mufti, half in uniform. No one knew where to billet all these people running around with a purposefulness that disconcerted the military authorities themselves, who expected to have to deal with hundreds of slackers and deserters. But everyone stepped forward obediently to put their liberty in chains, to stoop beneath the yoke of militarism. Narbonne, it's my first night there, curled up in a confessional booth of the former Capuchin church where we were all piled in. Narbonne, crowds of soldiers filling up hotels, cafes, and the coffers of the shopkeepers. Narbonne, the departure of 80th Active Line Regiment for the frontier on August 7th, the 280th Active Reserve Regiment on the 13th, both in the midst of indescribable enthusiasm. During the night of the 12th-13th, it was the turn of the 125th Territorial Regiment, which left for Morocco. In spite of the void left by the departure of these 3 regiments, the streets were just as packed with pantalons rouges, red trousers. Why call up in the same week, on the same day, 10 times more soldiers than were necessary, and bring normal life to such a sudden halt? Wouldn't it have been simpler, more sensible, to call up each reserve class as needed? But no, the mistrustful military flung itself upon the public like a beast upon its prey, and clutched it to itself in the iron grip of discipline. Who knew if these people, so docile, wouldn't regain their senses and their strength once the initial shock had passed? That's why they called up everyone, from the beardless conscripts to the old codgers of the rat, at the risk of not being able to house, feed and clothe all this vile rabble. We were kitted out in old, patched-up, filthy, ragged, cast-off clothing. Weren't we dazzling? As for food, that was even worse. Having nothing or almost nothing to eat, we emptied our purses into the pockets of hotel keepers, lousy cooks and other tradespeople. But we didn't complain too much because at first the discipline wasn't too rigorous. We still thought we were free men, but that couldn't last. We were soon subjected to the dictatorship of one Manival, named commandant of the different regimental depots of the city. This paragon of militarism started out by confining us all to quarters all day long, obliging us to nibble on bad and meagre food, and at night the doors opened only very late and then closed pitilessly at first call. Day and night patrols hunted those who tried to escape into town. I won't take the time to recount all the little irritants, the bothers, the big and petty tyrannies to which Manival subjected the garrison. That would take too long. This big striper was just right for running a prison hulk, not free men. But then we were no longer free, I forgot to say. Meanwhile, there was one fellow who defied Manival's authority, his orders, his instructions, with boldness and scorn. This man was known widely throughout Narbonne as Fallet, especially by the police, who picked him up almost daily, drunk on the sidewalk, after he had been amusing passers-by with his songs, skits and pantomime. He spent more nights in the town jail, sleeping off his wine, than he did in his barracks bunk, if he even had one. The war had made Fallet a soldier, but a drunk he was, and a drunk he remained. All the more because, right then, wine was selling for almost nothing, and was even given out for free at the Wine Growers' Association. A drunk thrives on liberty, open space, fresh air. It was clear that our disciple of Bacchus wouldn't be content to stroll in the little garden where the monks had come to read their prayer books and where a few stunted pines grew. That's why he usually missed the roll calls and the drills. In vain was he consigned to barracks. In vain were the sentries at the gates declared responsible for his whereabouts. Fallet slipped between them like a needle and disappeared. One day, right under the captain's nose, Fallet took off for the hills, or rather into town. I had the bad luck to be posted on guard duty, so the captain gave me the order to pursue the escapee and to bring him back into military custody. Here I was, with 4 fellow guards, in pursuit of Fallet, but he seemed to have sprouted wings. Our pursuit had no result other than attracting a bigger and bigger crowd of delighted street urchins, shouting, "You'll find him! No, you won't!" We had to come back to the barracks empty-handed. That night Fallet held court in a cafe and made as much racket as 4 men. An officer told him to pipe down. Fallet didn't take it well. He insulted the officer and even threatened him with a bayonet. The officer called in 2 policemen, who hauled Fallet off to a dingy cell of the 80th Regiment. The terrible Manival would no doubt have had this unlucky fellow shot out of hand, but Fallet had earned the sympathy of the public, who saw him as a harmless and easy-going drunk. Furious to see his despotic authority held in check, the Narbonnais dictator made a public notice in his orders of the day, flaying the conduct of Private Assans, who was sullying the uniform which, at the front, his comrades were covering with glory, holding him up to everyone's scorn, nailing him to the pillory, etc. Never had anyone piled such honours on Fallet. They made him a celebrity. He was let go, but far from repenting, he continued to do honour to the local vintages, which made him the frequent guest of Commandant Manival in the prison of the Montmorency barracks, as you can imagine. I mentioned that I arrived at Narbonne in a pitiful state of health. If I bring it up again, it's to point out the welcome I got from the majors, medical officers, whose help I sought. There were 2 doctors in the reserve units at Narbonne itself. In no time they had sent back to the ranks 100 sick men who paraded in front of them. You can understand that they weren't generous to me, despite my gaunt appearance. "Well," they said to me, "you had a mortal illness, you pulled through, and you still have the nerve to complain and waste our time?" "But I still need some care," I insisted. "I still can't digest anything except milk." "Enough! Who's next? Don't let us see you back here." That's how they sent me away, and how they sent away almost everyone who was sick. The guy behind me showed a suppurative wound on his stomach. "That's nothing, it will scab up," they said without even examining the wound. "Next!" And so forth. That very day, this fellow and I went to report these facts to Ferrul, the sympathetic mayor of Narbonne, and asked for his help. When he heard what we had to say, he angrily crumpled up a piece of paper on his desk and threw it to the floor, but said nothing. What good would a protest of his have done in this time of fever, of madness, when all of France was up in arms, in a state of siege? Of course he lavished on us what care he could freely, as he did to all the soldiers who came to him for help. Soon Manival was putting us through long drill sessions, day and night. It was a relief when we were assigned to duty at the powder magazine, the firing range, the railway station, etc. The firing range was on the banks of the Étang de Barge, and on shooting days our bullets chased the fishermen away. A detail of 4 men and a corporal stood guard day and night at the cabin where they kept the targets, and also kept watch over the embankment behind the targets to keep bullet collectors away. The 24 hours of guard duty in this spot should have pleased me greatly, due to the peace and quiet, the wide open space, the splendid view, the fresh air. But what made it very unpleasant was the company of millions of tiny, sharp-tongued mosquitoes that, as soon as the last ray of sunlight stretched across the lake, surged from the gorse and the bushes and attacked our poor skin, which nature had made so tender and sensitive. We had to light brush fires, the smoke from which kept them at bay. It was the only weapon at our disposal. That wasn't all. When you wanted to lie down on the 5 filthy mattresses which the military authorities had so generously provided, or simply on the planks of the camp beds, you had to be completely overcome with fatigue, so as to fall asleep before feeling the stingers of legions of famished ticks and lice, which infested these quarters, boring into your skin. Back at the barracks, the fleas had multiplied so quickly since our arrival that sometimes you had to resort to bunking outside, under the pine trees in the garden, at the risk of catching a head cold or a stiff neck. Duty at the railway station was more interesting, due to the variety of sights and sounds one could see there during the first few months of the war. The trains came and went without interruption, trains with Italian labourers heading home, refugees, war material, horses and troops who adorned their railway cars as if they were going to a party. These unknowing ones, how many bellicose, bragging inscriptions scrawled in chalk on the railway cars. One quickly saw the frivolous, childlike, presumptuous spirit of the French soldier. How many insults addressed to the Kaiser, to the Germans, that the officers should have erased if they had any sense of propriety or dignity. Then, one day, came the arrival of the first trainload of wounded men. I was on duty at the station when the first such train rolled in. What emotion! What a crowd! What enthusiasm! This was a big event. An hour before the arrival, something like 20,000 people massed around the station, barely held back by a full company of soldiers which had to be reinforced. Only the volunteer stretcher-bearers had the right to enter the platforms. To earn this envied privilege, local big shots and high officials signed up as porters. Finally, at 9 in the evening, the train bearing the wounded flesh entered the station. At the sight of the first stretcher emerging from the waiting room, there was mass delirium. The crowd applauded, wept, stamped their feet, pushed, seeking a closer look, and finally broke through the cordon of troops which could only yield. By midnight, the last automobile had long ago taken away the last of the wounded, but a dense crowd still waited in front of the station. Who knows? Maybe another train was coming in. Alas, in a week all the hospitals in the city were overflowing with wounded, and the authorities had to call upon the civic devotion of people willing to take care of wounded men in their homes. Oh, the inconstancy of enthusiasm, the fickleness of the mob. Barely a week after the first train arrived, indifference had already set in. Hearts became blasé. There was no longer anyone curious enough to witness the arrival of wounded men, ever more numerous, who sometimes were billeted right at the station because there was nowhere to send them. Really, there were too many of them. They were becoming bothersome. They should have waited until the first ones were healed. The hell of a nerve. By then everyone had his own situation to be sorry about, before having any time to pity others. Each family was in anxious expectation, uncertain about the fate of a loved one. Death began to choose its victims. Next came the passage of the first German prisoners, on their way to Castres or Perpignan. The crowd, alerted, had packed the railway crossing at the Avenue de Carcassonne, where a footbridge across the tracks threatened to collapse under the weight of spectators who crowded it, jammed onto the steps like amphitheatre seats. The length of the wait didn't daunt the crowd. Finally the train appeared, and the engineer, to be nice to the crowd, slowed his speed considerably. Spirits at this moment were overheated to the highest degree by the acts of savagery, true or false, that the hate-mongering newspapers laid upon the Germans. That was an extenuating circumstance for this crowd, which indulged in scandalous demonstrations while the convoy passed by. It was a clamour of imprecations and curses. Fine gentlemen brandished their canes, lovely ladies threatened with their silk parasols, urchins threw stones, the most fervent pulled out their knives and leaped onto the tracks, meekly resisted by the sentries. And even after the train had departed, the crowd still called out to the Germans, who must have gotten a fine idea of French culture in general, and Narbonnais courtesy in particular. But soon this ferocious hatred diminished, once there was proof that they didn't massacre all the prisoners they took, and that even, unimaginably, these barbarians cared for those who were wounded. This discovery boosted spirits, and from then on the passages of prisoners stirred up little more than curiosity, which diminished over time to the point of complete indifference, and even pity on the part of sensitive folks, more numerous than one would have thought. Besides, the curiosity of the crowds was distracted by various other spectacles. First of all was the stop at Narbonne for a few days of a magnificent Algerian division. We couldn't get enough of admiring the bearing, the parades, the marches of these zouaves, these proud, showy infantrymen in their unique outfits. What a difference compared to us, decked out in our overcoats, either too big or too short, patched-up old trousers, misshapen caps. There was plenty to be jealous about, plenty to envy. The Narbonnais had eyes only for these exotic Africans. And what a colonel they had. It gave us goosebumps just to look at him. High-strung, tough, hard-looking, he struck fear in his men like the plague. On the beautiful Promenade des Barques, the Canebière of Narbonne, I was walking one day with some comrades when this terrifying personage, whom we hadn't noticed, bounded across the avenue and asked us, indignantly and angrily, why we hadn't saluted him. "But, Colonel," we stammered, terrified, "we didn't see you." "Ah, you didn't see me?" cried this madman, crossing his arms and looking at us like a sparrow-hawk eyeing a little wren. "Well," he said with a scornful look at us, "I can only feel pity for you." And then he disappeared. 2 days later, I was posted as an orderly at the post of the weekly adjutant at the barracks of the 80th Regiment, when a vibrant bugle call shattered the air. It was the regiment of Zouaves, heading out on manoeuvres. At its head, slim and proud on his horse, rode the famous colonel. Those who had ventured out beyond the gate saluted him. Those who had stayed inside considered themselves exempt from this duty by distance, because the gate was back a good bit from the road. But the sharp eye of the colonel saw the offence committed against his lofty personage, and turning his bridle, he rode into the courtyard and took down the names of the delinquents, whom he sentenced to 6 days in prison. I believe that this colonel would have had us salute him a kilometre away, if he dared. A few days later, the Zouaves and their colonel embarked for the front. Good riddance. But we pitied the poor Zouaves being led into battle by such a brute. Not many were lucky enough to get back to Algeria, I'll bet. Several days afterward, more sensational news stirred up public curiosity, nothing less than the imminent passage of a vast army of Hindus who had landed at Marseille. What confirmed the truth of this unbelievable news were the rigorous security and surveillance measures put in place along the railway line. Almost all the available soldiers in the depot were deployed for 5 whole days, so as not to leave 1 metre without surveillance. And the famous Hindus indeed passed through, stopping for a few hours at Narbonne station for a meal break. But very few Narbonnais were able to satisfy their legitimate curiosity, since access to the station was strictly prohibited. For what reasons did they keep the crowd away from these warriors who had come from so far away to fight on our soil? It seems that there were fears that Ghoorkhas would make fun of their costumes, their habits, their prayers, etc., which was quite likely given the impertinence of our southern character. Their favourite dish was goat meat. They slaughtered the animals themselves at the station, but before killing them their priests had to bless them, which involved many prayers, genuflections, and benedictions. They also ate certain grains, of which I had a taste. These had no flavour to speak of. At the end of the meal, they lit a big pipe, which they could have called the squad's pipe, because in each group every man took a few puffs and then passed it fraternally to his neighbour. Montlouis. Incidents in the journey. The brutal porpoise, a Catalan welcome. The merry men. The Germanophobe medical officer, Poisserda. On October 2nd, 1914, I was part of a detachment of 25 men assigned to escort a convoy of German prisoners from the Narbonne station to Montlouis, where we would remain as prison guards. Thanks to this assignment, we were going to be able to breathe the pure air of the Pyrenees, and we left the Capuchin convent and the myriads of fleas whose living prey we had been, with no regrets. At 4 a.m, we were already at the station, although the train bringing the prisoners wasn't due until 5. The station was already in a near state of siege, and the old softy who exercised the function of station chief was under great pressure. Guards were everywhere, instructions were flying back and forth, civilians were chased off the platforms and herded into the waiting rooms. If they had been expecting a trainload of madmen or cannibals or dangerous criminals, they wouldn't have taken more careful precautions. Finally, the long-awaited train arrived. It had hardly stopped before we, in groups of 6, hoisted ourselves into the carloads of prisoners, with bayonets fixed to the barrels of our loaded rifles, as if mounting an assault. The escort got off, and we took its place. The Germans were seated on benches running along the sides of each freight car. We sat on planks in the middle, since the prisoners weren't so polite as to offer us their seats. Silent, peaceful, they acted like good little children, smiling at us, no doubt looking to earn our good graces. The train had only just started up when we were not a little surprised to hear the Marseillaise being sung, in a voice without the slightest accent, by one of the prisoners. It was an Alsatian who gave us this surprise. The others listened, indifferent and impassive. From that point, the Alsatian joined easily into our conversation, served as an interpreter, and we shared with him our meals, which were a bit more substantial than what the prisoners had to eat. Soon we were riding alongside the Mediterranean, the Big Blue. At this very moment the sun rose, seeming to leap right out of the waves. This was a magic spectacle, an apotheosis of colours, of rays and reflections, quickly succeeding the grey tints of dawn. Instinctively the Germans leaned toward the open door of the freight car to take in the view of this enchanting scene. We didn't push them back. We were indulgent and a little proud of how they admired our blue lake, our beautiful sun of the Midi. Further along we passed through a large estate so filled with game that the noise of the train flushed out whole companies of quail, squads of rabbits, columns of guinea fowl, pheasants, etc. Frenchmen and Germans crowded at the open door of the car, marvelling and pointing at all the fleeing beasts and birds. From then on, a détente existed between guards and captives. The prisoners dared to chat among themselves in low voices, and even to hum and sing a few songs, with melodious airs but rude and guttural words, proof that nature had created 2 categories of larynx, one for the French, the other for the Germans. At the station at Salses, there was a stop. A Marine infantry non-com climbed onto the step of our wagon, looked around, and then pounced on a German and grabbed his distinctive baker's cap with the clear intention of appropriating it. But the German saw right away what was happening. He quickly clamped his hands on his head and held on to his headgear with all his might. "Will you give it up, dirty Boche?" slang for a German, said the Marine sergeant, raising his fist and bringing it down once, twice, 3 times into the face of the German, who was pale with rage but who didn't let go of his cap. His neighbours tried to lend their aid, but the marsouin, literally porpoise, slang for a French Marine, ended up victorious and ran off with the cap. This all happened so fast that we couldn't intervene. In my role as corporal, chef de wagon, in charge, I said to this brutal visitor, "If you want trophies, go find them on the battlefield. Get out of here." But a non-com, from a colonial regiment no less, has no dealings with an infantry corporal, and a territorial one at that. That's why it was just as if I hadn't protested at all. I then asked a comrade to go ask the lieutenant who commanded the detachment, but when he brought him back, the thief had disappeared, off into the countryside. Now the victim wept hot tears of anger, shame and regret over the loss of his headgear. But one of us made him a gift of a bonnet de police, fatigue cap, which was disdainfully refused. Finally, upon our insistence, the German accepted it, more as a duty than in goodwill. At Perpignan there was a newspaper famous for its jingoism. Its exaggerations played right into the worst prejudices of its readers, and right now exacerbated the hatred for the Germans, who were nothing but monsters with human faces. Of all the southerners, the Catalans are the ones with, as we say, the blood closest to the head, ready to fly off the handle, to demonstrate with enthusiasm and fire their most extreme sympathies and antipathies. These aren't faults, they are characteristics of their race. So this newspaper, having learned the date of our passage, didn't waste any time in announcing it as an event of the highest importance, in terms which persuaded the Catalans that it was their patriotic duty to come and shout their hatred at these disarmed soldiers. From Perpignan, at each level crossing, at each station, a furious crowd awaited us, spewing imprecations and curses upon the uneasy prisoners. The women were the most extreme. They tried to climb into the cars to spit on the prisoners, and some threatened them with knives, clubs and stones. There's no doubt that if the prisoners had been handed over to them, they would have had a rough time of it. In contrast to us Frenchmen, they brought grapes, figs and other fruits, and they filled our canteens with wine, the good, rich wine of Roussillon. "Just don't give any to these murderers," they said to us. But once the train started up, we wasted no time in sharing all of it with the prisoners. This act of camaraderie made up for the odious demonstrations against disarmed enemies. At parades, the crowd extended along both sides of the track. The cars were opened only on one side, so half the crowd, disappointed to be on the closed-up side, protested so violently that, to prevent regrettable incidents, we had to open the car doors on both sides, which made our guard duty even more difficult to fend off the waves of enraged patriots, especially the women who predominated. At the station of Villefranche-de-Conflans, we changed to the electric railroad. Recently built, climbing up into the Pyrenees, this line followed the valley of the river Tete, rolling along the bottom of deep gorges or climbing along the flank of a precipice, twice crossing the valley on bridges which were perhaps unique in France, one a suspension bridge, the other one made of stone. We all felt sensations of fright and vertigo, and were gripped with ecstasy before the grandiose beauty of these mountains, these rocky cliffs, these valleys, woods and waterfalls. Now all was calm and solitude, no more howling mobs. The villages were few and far between, peopled with inoffensive shepherds and peaceable woodcutters. The track that we were following, which ran right up to the Spanish frontier, had been inaugurated a few years earlier in a tragic fashion. The engineers and other notables had taken their places in the very first train coming down from the Pyrenees, when for one reason or another the brakes didn't work or weren't strong enough, and the runaway train picked up a dizzying speed and ended up jumping the tracks and tumbling all the way to the bottom of a precipice. One can imagine how the travellers felt, nearly all of whom met their deaths. The mountain had claimed its revenge for being conquered by the intelligence and boldness of man. At noon we got off at the station of La Cabanasse, which served the village of Montlouis, perched at the summit of a rugged, long ridge which seemed to climb right up to the clouds. Montlouis itself is dominated by high mountains, from which one could enjoy a grandiose panorama, but I never made the ascent because my legs couldn't take a climb lasting several hours. I contented myself with the panorama which was spread out all around us. Below the fortress, at the bottom of a deep valley, flowed the river Tete, which tumbled wildly through rocks and waterfalls. Then, on the other side, ran the only road which goes to Spain from this side of the Pyrenees. This fortress had been built by Vauban, and right down to the smallest detail you could see the art, the genius which had guided its construction, still valid right up to the development of present-day artillery. Montlouis was a redoubtable stronghold, utterly impregnable to assault. A first ring of walls encircled the village of about 1,000 inhabitants, and a second enclosed the barracks, casemates, magazines, etc. In ordinary times, one company occupied the fort. Now we were going to guard 600 prisoners there, which was a dangerous imprudence given the proximity of the Spanish frontier, about 12 kilometers away, and also given our weak number, about 100, and no other troops between us and the border. The Germans moved about freely in daylight through the courtyards of the fort. It would have been simple for them to overwhelm us and escape. Not to do so showed that they weren't driven to seek their freedom. It's true that they couldn't know that at the border only a few customs agents stood guard, not for them but for smugglers. A few days before our arrival, Montlouis had been the scene of grave incidents. By a capricious decision of our high command, all the joyeux, merry men in France, reservists assigned to disciplinary battalions of French African Army units, had been assembled at Montlouis for mobilization. They made their way there, but for reasons unknown to me, soon after they arrived, they mutinied, pillaged, vandalized whatever they could, then burst through the gates and spread through the village, terrorizing the inhabitants. It took the arrival of a detachment of troops from Perpignan to re-establish order. Soon they were all sent back to Africa. They were refused the honour of going to the front, of dying for the fatherland. No one had confidence in them. It remains to be seen if these merry men felt humiliated, or to the contrary, relieved to be so far from the fields of honour. You could still see the results of the looting. What was especially heartbreaking was to see with what brutality and greed they had broken into, and rifled the footlockers of the young soldiers of the garrison, who had packed them with their personal belongings, in haste, right when they were heading off to the front. Clothing, letters, souvenirs, etc. Anything of value had disappeared. The rest lay scattered pell-mell throughout the rooms. The Boches, treated as barbarians and bandits every day in our newspapers, were paschal lambs beside our terrible zephyrs, whirlwinds, from Africa. Our German prisoners showed themselves to be quite docile, and there wasn't the slightest incident on their part during my stay at Montlouis. They didn't have too much to complain about during their captivity. Not much work, pretty good lodging, bedded down and fed about the same as we were. They could indulge themselves at the canteen, 1 hour a day. Nevertheless, some of them weren't satisfied with all that. They monitored our mess teams carrying back our leftovers to the kitchens or to tubs of greasy water, and stuffed themselves with the remainders of inedible portions, tendons, fat and gristle, gnawed bones, etc. Some of our men amused themselves by throwing out the windows pieces of bread which fell into the mud, where 10 hands grappled to seize them. Among the prisoners were 10 or so from Alsace-Lorraine, who spoke French more or less fluently. They were introduced one day to a general who had come to Montlouis on an inspection tour. This general naively thought that he was doing them a great honour by granting them permission to enlist in the French army. But at this proposition the Alsatians and Lorrainers, or those pretending to be, grimaced and refused, claiming that if they joined up on our side, they wouldn't be able to return to their native lands when the war was over. "What?" cried the scandalized general. "They doubt our victory? Well, let's treat these people just like the Boches they are." But thanks to the service they could render by their knowledge of the 2 languages, they had a privileged situation from then on. To keep the prisoners busy, they were obliged to carry out military exercises, war games, and drills. It would have been smarter to have them do some useful work. What a difference between their drill field manoeuvres and ours. The command to attention transformed them into marble statues. Their ranks and columns were as straight as a rule. They pivoted on a compass point, and all their movements were automatic and geometrical. When each evening our guard changed, the Germans mocked the awkwardness and irregularity of our to-the-right march and our pitiful presenting of arms, so much so that the captain made us assemble behind a building which blocked the prisoners' view of us. Then, to improve our skills, unlike the Germans, we had to drill outside the fortress, open to the biting winds, which chapped our lips and chilled our throats. The snow started to fall heavily during October, and we shivered in our rooms in spite of the stoves stuffed with firewood cut by prisoner work details in nearby forests. One fine day we took a little march to the Col de la Perche, from which the road descended the opposite slope of the Pyrenees. During the French Revolution, a furious battle took place here. It seems that the Spanish tried to grab what didn't belong to them, and they were severely thrashed for doing so. Near there was the enclave of Livia. By the Treaty of the Pyrenees, Louis XIV, eager to establish a foothold on the other side of the Pyrenees, demanded the cession of 30 villages of the Spanish Cerdagne, but in the list of these villages, Livia was forgotten and remained Spanish. A neutral road links it to Spain. Its inhabitants can bless this omission, which deprived them of the honour of being subjects of Louis XIV TG, but which spared their great-grandchildren the sacrifices and the horrors which the present ignoble war would have imposed upon them. From the Col de la Perche, along a mountainside and the edge of a wood, you could see the sumptuous hotel of Font-Romeu, built by the railroad company, the Compagnie de Chemin de Fer du Midi. The capitalists could come here and breathe the extra-pure air, which would have done more good to the families of workers piled up in airless hovels in the cities. But in order to come and vacation in this hotel, furnished with every modern comfort and excessive convenience, you had to have a big, bulging wallet and be able to live, play, get fat, and have fun upon the sweat of others. In these enthusiastic times, the frontier wasn't guarded. Why should it be? The French who lived in Spain rushed into France to enlist. It was even thought that suitably trained Spaniards would come over too, but they didn't appreciate the purity of our cause and egotistically stayed home. Our bosses were so trustful of us that they granted us leave on Sunday to go spend the day in Puigcerdà, the first Spanish locale across the border. Taking advantage of this incredible liberty, one Sunday I took the electric train and descended the other slope of the Pyrenees all the way to Bourg-Madame, the last French village. The railway went no farther, since the Spaniards weren't rich enough to continue it, but Puigcerdà was barely a kilometre away. At the customs post, the carabineros politely asked us to leave our bayonets with them, which they would give back to us when we returned. That was the only formality required to have the right to tread the soil of hospitable Spain. Near the post, a river, the Segre, divided the two nations. It was Louis XIV ambition which made this little stream the border. Puigcerdà is a pretty little town beside a little lake. The wine was good, tasty, and very inexpensive at the Posada d'Aragon, where for a modest price you could have an excellent meal, and then puff away on some detestable cigars and cigarettes while strolling around town. It was a fine autumn Sunday, and happiness was in the air. Young men and girls flocked to numerous dance parties, where you could hear loud music from the organs, accordions, or guitars. This made our hearts ache. Over on our side, nobody thought about having fun anymore. The war dominated everything, and spirits were burdened with anguish and worry. And all this joy, these appeals to pleasure and love, shocked us. Come to think of it, the Spaniards would have been silly to share these sentiments with us. Had we been overcome with gloom in France when our neighbours were being massacred in Cuba or in Morocco? At the Posada where I had lunch, I struck up a conversation, half in French, half in Spanish, with my neighbour at the next table, and I asked him what he thought about this war. He gave an extraordinary answer. When there's war in Spain, everybody who can get away heads for France. The French do exactly the opposite. The ones who live here leave Spain and go home to fight. And this Spaniard didn't try to explain. He evidently thought that we were no more intelligent than they were. Keep in mind that the Spaniard has all the characteristics of what one calls a good soldier. Sober, durable, sharp, valiant. But he doesn't have a warrior spirit, and his proud and independent personality doesn't bend well to the odious yoke of discipline. That's why my luncheon companion was so baffled. I didn't visit Puigcerdà again, because my departure for the front was near, but I don't want to end the story of my stay at Montlouis without saying a word about the medical officer whom we had there, the Major, and about his attitude toward the prisoners who needed his enlightened care. Someone had discovered in the back of an infirmary locker a container of cod liver oil which had gone rancid. Even in its prime, it's not a very savoury drink. Think about how going rancid might improve it. For as long as it lasted, this oil was administered copiously and generously to the Germans who presented themselves at sick bay. The grimaces of these fellows brought joy to the Major and his staff. If the sick man came back the next day, that was truly an exception. One day they vaccinated the prisoners against smallpox. The major had a field day wielding his scalpel. Some fainted dead away, while those who could bear it squealed as if their throats were being cut. One morning, when I was present at sick bay, a prisoner showed up with a badly swollen cheek. The major, to take care of him, took up his pliers and his scalpels and went to work on his jaw and his molars. The unfortunate one, stricken with terror, ran away howling. The major burst into laughter, and to push the farce even further, he had the German seized by the guards and hauled back. Terrified, the prisoner had to have his painful jaws worked on with care as tender as you could imagine. One evening, when I was on guard duty, the prisoners called out through the bars of a casemate. One of their comrades was very sick, they said. Escorted by 4 fellow guards and carrying a lantern and a ring of big keys dating back to Vauban, I made my way into the casemate and saw that a dozen Germans were grouped around the sick man and had piled up blankets over him to keep him warm. They begged me to find the major. Herr Dr. Sanitor, they said, trying to be understood. 5 minutes later, I found, in a café, the medical staff corporal, who was none other than Edouard Durand from my hometown, Peyriac. He was willing to leave his card game and to run to find the major, even though he said he knew this would get him a kick in the teeth. Sure enough, the major told him that he wasn't going to bestir himself for a Boche, and that if the prisoner croaked, all that was needed was to haul his carcass to the dung heap. With a bit more humanity, my comrade Durand went back to the infirmary and made a cup of tea that was brought to the sick man. That didn't keep him from croaking 3 or 4 days later, at the infirmary where at last they had finally brought him. No one would want to write about such an attitude on the part of a doctor who might hate the Germans, but should be able to overcome that hatred and fulfill his duty. His mission is to care for those who suffer, whoever they might be. While we were at Montlouis, the depots in the garrison towns emptied rapidly. At the end of October, 2 reserve classes, the youngest of the territorial army, one of which I belonged to, were assigned to leave for the front to reinforce the 2 regiments from Narbonne, the 80th and the 280th, which had just been decimated. Ah, how extravagant our generals were with the lives of others. On October 30th, 1914, 30 of us territorials from the conscription reserve classes of 1899 and 1900 left Montlouis to rejoin our depot at Narbonne. A thick blanket of snow covered the ground. A cold wind chilled our bodies and our hearts. Henceforth we were destined for sacrifice. We were going to follow the stations of the cross, on painful marches along which our dead bodies would litter the path. A ray of sunlight would have diminished our melancholy, our sadness, but this storm which shrouded the surrounding mountains in fog dampened our flagging spirits. At noon sharp we filed into the courtyard where the prisoners had shovelled a path for us in the snow. These fellows, massed under the vaults of the fortress, saluted us all. Was this derision or mockery? I looked at them, but no, their faces were grave. They were saluting gladiators descending into the blood-stained arena. They honoured the victims who were going to suffer and die. Our captain accompanied us as far as the station at La Cabanasse, in spite of the lousy weather and the very bad condition of the road. We knew he didn't do it willingly. By his haughty attitude, so cold in his dealings with us, he had lost our sympathy. He felt obliged to give us a little speech which had no comforting effect on us. It really wasn't worth his catching a cold to come as far as La Cabanasse. At 8 in the evening we arrived at Perpignan, where we had to wait a couple of hours. What a difference in temperature. Here, not the slightest trace of snow. In this corner of France, privileged in its climate, there was still the sweet warmth of autumn. All Perpignan was out on the streets, and an enormous crowd jammed a square and adjacent streets. From moment to moment you heard applause, cries of anger, of fury, one after the other. Sometimes the crowd was convulsed with mad laughter. What were they looking at, these gawkers, instead of quietly going home to their beds? I approached and found myself outside the offices of the famous jingoistic newspaper of the Pyrenees Orientales, Departement. Every 10 minutes there appeared, projected in luminous letters on a screen on the building's facade, the news headlines which would appear in the newspaper the next day. You can guess that everything was exaggerated, blown up, and the slightest event was presented as a great drama. Despite the fact that at this point everything was going from bad to worse, the situation was presented as excellent. The Catalans were letting their heads get stuffed with nonsense, just like the vulgar Parisians. In the station, a big billboard caught our attention. It read, "Here we give out wine à l'oeil for free," and instead of the final word, there was a gigantic OL-I. Free wine. Was this possible? It's true. This was a gift from wine growers for soldiers passing through. You could fill your stomach as well as your canteen, bottles, etc. Each cask of wine bore the name of its proprietor and the vintage, and you could pick from among the most famous wines. This was heaven for even the most sober soldier. To tell the truth, at this time the price of wine was very low, and this tempting and beneficial billboard would soon disappear. At 3 in the morning we entered the Montmorency barracks in Narbonne. The dictator Manival certainly knew about our arrival, because it was on his orders that we were coming, but nothing was prepared for our reception. I don't want to say that we were expecting drums and bugles in our honour at the station, or that the barracks would be all decked out. We would have been happy with a mug of hot coffee upon our arrival, and a comfortable spot to spend the night, even if it was planks to stretch out on. But even that was expecting too much. We had to start getting used to suffering. Manival hadn't deigned to take the trouble to alert the authorities about our arrival. We had to go into town to seek out the battalion adjutant, a grumpy, bilious Corsican who showed up in a furor at being bothered this way. Without a care about waking up everyone, since he already was up, he had the buglers on duty call out all 8 company sergeants in the depot. It took 3 bugle calls for all the sergeants to turn up. Think about what kind of welcome they gave the newcomers. The Corsican dealt us out haphazardly to each NCO, non-commissioned officer or non-com. With 3 other comrades, I was led into a billet already full of sleepers, sprawled out pell-mell on scraps of straw, and we succeeded in spending the night in this pile of ticks, fleas and lice, which the barracks by now was well provisioned with. The next day, November 1st, at 5 in the afternoon, a reinforcement of 700 men from the first 3 classes of the Territorial Army left for the front to rejoin the 280th Reserve de l'Active Infantry Regiment, which had been decimated near Bethune. Manival wanted us to clear out with this detachment. Luckily, we didn't have enough time to get kitted out and equipped, but we were alerted to be ready to leave the following Wednesday. As this was on a Saturday, we rushed to our company command posts to request 24-hour furloughs for the next day, to go home and embrace our families one last time. But alas, under the fallacious pretext that the Sunday furlough requests had to be submitted to the Grand Inquisitor Manival by no later than the Thursday before, this satisfaction was denied us. A condemned man is granted the opportunity to see his loved ones, one last time. But we didn't get that. We weren't supposed to get all soft in the heart, right when we were heading out. There was no thought of leaving in any case. The railway station was under a state of siege, an NCO at every ticket window, others at the access points to the platforms, warnings posted everywhere. But nothing could stop me. With a couple of comrades, scorning the warnings of Manival, we headed out of Narbonne on foot and caught the outbound train at the next station, Marcorignan, and so I had the pleasure of spending the next day in the midst of my family.